Wait for them to come up. So while it's happening, yes, I'm Tony Hickson, I'm Chief Business Officer. For those of you that may not know, I think most people probably know that Cancer Research Horizons is the wholly owned subsidiary of Cancer Research UK that does the innovation for it. It consists of a commercial arm, which I run, and then there's a drug discovery arm as well, which provides drug discovery support to scientists and develops new therapeutics in cancer. It's a not-for-profit operation, i.e., it does do commercial deals and it does generate a surplus, and we reinvest that surplus back into cancer research. But the reason we exist is for impact, not to generate money. We're lucky enough that we do, but that's not why we exist. And we'll talk a bit more about that during this presentation. Yeah, so next slide, please. Thanks. So I think during this presentation, Sonia asked me to sort of, oops, bit of feedback. Uh, Sonia asked me to focus on the sort of interface between charities and tech transfer offices and this whole sort of translational area, which I think is becoming more interesting for charities going forward. The perspective I'm coming from is sort of having seen it from different angles. So I recently wrote a report for UKRI, which was about how universities and investors work together and how to improve and deepen those links. Obviously, I work for a charity, but on the commercial side. And I previously worked for a tech transfer office for 16 years, where I was the managing director at Imperial College's tech transfer office, Imperial Innovations, which also went on a bit of an interesting journey in that we ultimately listed it on the London Stock Exchange and raised 600 million to invest back into university science. So I've sort of seen a bit from the investor side and a bit from the university side and a bit from the charity side. So it should be an interesting discussion. Next slide, please. So just starting with the basics, I'm sure most of you know what a university TTO is, but just in case anyone doesn't, if you just bring up the next slide. So a tech transfer office, TTO. So if we start from the basics, the university is a charity. Most universities in the UK are incorporated as charities. And under UK law, it's the same for whether it's a company or a charity. The business that employs that person owns the intellectual property of that person, unless you actually do something, unless you actively decide to make that different. So universities own their employees' intellectual property to the extent that the IP arises in the normal course of their business. So if they're academics researching an area, it belongs to university. If they're an academic who comes up with a new, in therapeutics, and they come up with a new design for a boat mast in their garage, it belongs to them. It doesn't belong to university. So, because this issue of whether it arises during your employment often comes up. And why translate? Well, there's now a number of angles to this. Why do universities feel an obligation to translate their ideas into products and services that benefit societies? Well, there is an obligation from the funders, so people like Cancer Research UK, people like the MRC. We put obligations on the people we fund to maximize the value of that arising IP. We're not just funding it to result in publications. We want to see any IP that arises from the research that we fund turned into products and services that for us benefit cancer patients, for MRC benefit the UK and society, but it all ends up in the same place. There's also the UK Charities Act. Universities are charities, and therefore they have an obligation enshrined in law to maximise the value of their assets. Intellectual property is an asset. And then lastly, there's ref impact. So the universities now have sort of 20%, I think it is, I can't remember if it's 20 or 25, but a significant percentage of their marks, the way they're assessed every sort of 5 to 7 years, is about the impact that their research has on society and patients. And more importantly, that impact results in hard cash. A university ref impact case study for a university like Imperial or Oxford is worth £1 million to the university. So it's not just, demonstrating it, but it actually results in real money back to university. So there's a lot of incentives now to translate, and that's, I think, why we're seeing a lot more. Knowledge exchange is a blanket term. You'll see that used a lot now, and that encompasses both IP commercialization, but also consultancy, engaging with industry, sponsored research, outreach, student enterprise. It's a catch-all term. I would say tech transfer is a subset of knowledge exchange and is focused more on patent filing, licensing, venture investment. And there's a huge disparity between tech transfer offices across the UK. There's some universities like Oxford, like ourselves, like Cambridge, have over 100 people in the tech transfer group doing this. And they're highly specialized within that. So some people are focused on venture creation, some on licensing, some on patent filing. Some small universities have less than 5 people, and one person is doing everything. They're doing everything in KE. They're doing knowledge outreach, they're doing consultancy, they're doing patent filing, they're doing venture creation. So there's a big difference when you come across these tech transfer offices, and it's worth finding out, how well resourced they are and what they're doing. Next slide, please. So if we just quickly look at impact versus commercial return, and so next slide, because obviously your trustees will probably ask, why are you interested in translation? Um, and there's the impact side. So there's demonstrating impact to your donors. And obviously, this is really important for us as charities. We need increasingly donors want to know not just about the interest in research and the publications, but they want to know, well, how is this actually benefiting patients in the medical charity world? Um, and so therefore there is a return on investment, but the return is patient impact. And that leads us on to the whole, how do you measure that? And we're needing to get increasingly sophisticated about that. We can maybe talk about that in the Q&A. But there's also a commercial return. And so you can get royalties from drug or diagnostic sales. You can get equity proceeds realizing from an exit from a startup. Um, and I think, sometimes over a long period of time, you can generate a positive return on that. So we've been lucky and we've returned over 600 million back to charity over the last sort of 10 or 20 years. But that is a product of decades of investment by CRUK in this activity because it truly believes in it. Written into Cancer Research UK's charitable statute in Companies House, it says to do research and to translate it into benefits for patients. So it's core purpose. Translation is core purpose. It's not an add-on to what we do. It's why we exist. Next slide, please. I think the important thing here, though, is you often hear case studies like this. So you hear about the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, a sort of very famous case where a long time ago they invested 150 million in a biotech company called Vertex that was developing a new cystic fibrosis drug. Ultimately, that drug went all the way to market, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation had royalties on it, and they were able to sell those royalties for 3.3 billion pounds. So that's 20 times the foundation's annual budget. I think the issue with this is actually it's a problem, not a great case study because everyone thinks they can replicate it, but the reality is they were lucky. They chose really well. They chose a really good partner. They had a breakthrough drug for which no other solution existed, so it was a huge seller, and they sort of got in early. But the chances of replicating that are a bit like saying, well, I know someone who won the lottery, so we should all put money into the lottery. It's a very sort of dangerous case study to use to set the model. So I think what I'm really trying to say here is if you're going to enter this translational space, my personal view is do it for the impact and measure the impact. Don't do it expecting a significant return. You might get one, you might get lucky, but if you do it and you sell it to your trustees as generating a return for the charity, you could be waiting a long time. Next slide, please. The other thing is just sort of recognizing either investors or donors. They fall into these categories as well. Because I guess what we've learned is that you have donors who give unrestricted money to the charity, use it for any purpose. And then you have donors who are restricted. They want it, you want us to build a building or name it after them or something like that, or to only put it into childhood cancer or something like that. But then there's a new category that we only recently have we started to realize exists, which are donors who will put money into the charity, but want to see a return generated from that then gets ploughed back into charity. So they're not taking a return, but they want to see it recycled and they want to see the money spent on more translational activity, not on basic research activity. So I think recognizing what your donors want and the need to and characterizing your donors is something we all need to get better at. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. Clearly, we as medical charities are more at the front end of this. There's less of the sort of pure financial investment going on. Next slide. So the other thing that I was asked to just talk about was the sort of what I found out through doing this review for UKRI. And so the review was very much focused on universities and investors. So it wasn't a general spin out review or review of knowledge exchange. It was focused on universities working with investors, and therefore the spin out companies was the main issue. Why is that important? Well, like it or not, the reality is 20 years ago in tech transfer, the sort of adage was you would file a patent on a new idea and then you would flip it to industry by finding a licensing partner. So you go out there, you market the patent to lots of people, and then you try and license it to industry. And that sort of worked for a while. But that gap has got much bigger. And increasingly, there is more emphasis now on venture building and creating startups. And there's this sort of cultural change. There's a whole new generation of students who've gone through accelerators and models like that who are becoming the new generation of academics. And they don't have this sort of thing we often talk about in the UK is our sort of, oh, we're too risk averse and we don't know how to be entrepreneurs. To be honest, that was the story of 20 years ago. It's not the story of now. This whole new generation of academics all want to be successful academics, but they also want startup companies. And so this issue of spin-outs and investment is becoming increasingly important. So looking into this a bit, I think, one thing, the reason governments, I think, trigger these type of reviews is they get moaning from investors about universities and vice versa. And it's because people simplify it. They say, oh, universities can't work with investors. But that's a very unfair statement because universities all have different motivations. Some are research intensive, some are more entrepreneurial, some are more engaged in civic responsibility and wealth creation in their local region, and some are teaching houses mainly. So to characterize them as all the same thing is flawed. It's even worse when you get to investors. I sort of identified over 17 different types of investor, all the way from friends and family writing small checks, family office funds, venture builders and accelerators, seed funds, venture capital, and then beyond venture capital, you get into regional investment funds and you get into government funds and scale up investors and pension funds. And then even the motivation of the investors is different, i.e., some of them want to invest directly in companies, and some of them want to invest in funds that then invest in companies. So fund of fund investors, LP investors, they call them. And then some are motivated by getting a return, and some are motivated by impact. And so the whole scene is far more complex, I think, than many people try and boil it down to in simplicity. And I think recognizing that is an important start. Next slide, please. But the other really important thing is I think, things are changing. You've probably heard about UKRI's sort of movement now towards not only funding curiosity-driven research in universities, but also ensuring that the research is aligned with the new industrial strategy. So the industrial strategy 8, of which 6 are particularly important in universities. Why is this important? Well, we know now we have data. So universities now in the UK have to put all of their spin-outs onto a register. So we actually have hard data. And we can now definitively say that the companies that raise the most venture capital in certain fields predominantly come from universities. And those fields are aligned with many of the government's priorities in terms of the industrial strategy. So if you're in pharma or biotech, if you're in semiconductors, if you're in medical devices, materials, gas, advanced manufacturing, most of the companies raising the most capital come out of university spin-outs. And that's a really important message for the government to hear. This is not because often the startup community will just say, oh, not everything comes out of university. But actually, in the sectors the government is saying matters, some of the most important companies come out of universities. What's also really interesting, just as an aside, is that IT software, only 5% come from universities. So many of the software investors who are complaining about universities, they only encounter a university spin out one in every 20 companies. And they find all the bureaucracy and everything that goes with that very difficult to deal with, but they're not used to dealing with it because the vast majority just come from the general community. Just an interesting observation. Next slide, please. So there were two gaps identified in the review. There's a lot of talk, quite rightly, in the UK about the scale-up gap. So, it's a big improvement. 20 years ago, everyone used to start the sentence with, We're really good at research in UK, but we're rubbish at getting it out of our universities. You don't hear that so much now. What you hear now is we've cracked the startup code from our universities. We know how to spin them out now. The problem is we can't scale them and keep them in the UK. They just get sold off or they go overseas really quickly. So the government is really quite rightly obsessed by the scale up gap, which needs a lot of money. They put 26 billion into the British Business Bank. They've created a National Wealth Fund, and they've got the Mansion House Accords, which are a way of trying to get pension capital back into this startup asset class. That's a world a million miles away from where we all operate, but it's important to recognize. The point I'm making is there's another gap right at the very beginning, which is the pre-spin out, just before you spin out. You finish research, this is translational gap, but you're not yet ready to spin out. And that translational gap still exists, the proof of concept gap, some people call it. And there is a real dearth of capital there. So the government's proof of concept fund is £8 million per year. Stanford University spends 20 to 30 million pounds a year alone. Leuven University in Belgium spends 20 million alone, just one university in one region of Belgium. And we have 8 million for the entirety of the UK. So we are massively underhitting on that initial phase. And this is important because charities, I think, play an important role in helping to fill that gap. But we also need the government to fill that gap as well. So that was one of the message we were trying to send. Next slide, please. And we need more contiguous pathways. So the other thing that you see in other countries is they have a better joined up pathway. Once you start it and you start moving along that pathway, you can get access to follow-on capital in an easier way. Whereas in the UK, we have lots of discrete pots and you have to sort of, stop being funded by the MRC and then you have to apply to Innovate UK once you incorporate, and then Innovate UK funds you. And so it's a very, we tend to drip feed our companies and not take them on a journey. And certainly this is a message Innovate UK have got loud and clear, not just because of my report, and they are now actively building pathways and have a lot of evidence to show that they are addressing this. Next slide, please. And lastly, this is sort of out of scope for this discussion, but there is, it is very clear that the reason we can't scale companies in this country is because by the time initially they take 80% of their capital from UK investors for the seed rounds. By the time they get to needing 100 million and they're scaling, 80% of the capital comes from overseas investors who then drag that company inexorably overseas. So we have to fix that domestic scale up capital availability problem. And I think the government realizes there's a gap and are trying to do things about it. Next slide, please. So lastly, just on equity stakes, you might pick up about this. There's a lot of heat and light generated about universities taking too much equity. But firstly, it was never really the issue. If you look at this data from Oxford, and you can see halfway along there at the top, there's an arrow, and that is when Oxford Science Enterprises was created, a local venture capital fund that put £800 million available. And you can see the explosion of companies that occurred after that. Now, Oxford equity stake has remained at 50% all the way through that, right up until the last couple of years, where it's gone down to 20%. And there's been no material change since it went from 50 to 20%, because the equity stake, in my view, is a red herring. Investors like to make a huge fuss about it, but actually it's the availability of capital that makes the difference. Next slide, please. So what were the issues that really came up? They were, we need to create startups that are ready for investors to engage with. Many of them are just, we give them a bit of money, they do a lot of work, and investors say, well, it's still too early and you've done all the wrong things. So you have to engage with investors much earlier in the process. We still spin out companies too soon. And when you look at this, a lot of that is grant chasing. So Innovate UK, fabulous organization, really trying to help. But they do things like they've got a venture pilot builder, right, which is 150K, but you cannot get the 150K until you incorporate a company. But 150K is not going to get you anywhere in terms of even a medical device is not going to get you anywhere, diagnostic, let alone a therapeutic. So they rush to form the company to simply get the Innovate UK money, and then they're stranded because they can't then move it on. So I think what we need is, and these are things like convertible loan notes and safe agreements. These are agreements where you effectively in translational funds, you're de-risking the technology before you press the incorporation button. And that's really important, I think, for us to do it. And then finally, just to speed the whole process up. There's the whole cycle of innovation is speeding up. We've got China moving twice as fast as us. There's conflict-driven innovation. There's AI. Tech investors haven't got time to wait around. We need to move much more quickly, and that needs us to begin to standardize some of our approaches to address that. Next slide, please. And then the other thing is just to say that accelerators and venture builders, these are important from a charity point of view because charities can team up and add expertise. So we are actively thinking or probably going to form a cancer therapeutics accelerator. We already have a cancer tech accelerator in partnership with some people. And that's because we're seeing a need for specialist accelerators. The UK has the most heavily incubated economy at the startup phase in the whole world. We have over 500 accelerators operating in the country. But when you look at them, they're mainly generic. They're mainly Y Combinator software type models, beer, pizza, pitching club at the end of it, demo day competition. That doesn't really help highly specialized cancer therapeutic companies. And you need an extra layer of highly specialized accelerators to help academics shape their companies to be investment ready. So I think that's probably the next stage is more specialist accelerators. Next slide. So to move on to the last part of the talk, this is how, talking a bit about working with TTO. So next slide. We know charity funding is really important. This is just some Cambridge data, but you can see there, charities are up there with funding in many universities, the same as research councils, the government is funding. So we all know this. Medical research charities fund a disproportionate amount of research compared to other countries in the world in the UK. Next slide, please. And by the way, that might become even more important as UKRI shifts the balance towards more applied stuff. Universities probably going to look to charities more to fund the fundamental research. How charities can help, you probably know all this. Well, I'm sure you know all this anyway. Obviously, we fund discovery research. IP might arise from that. Increasingly, there seems to be appetite from charities to fund translational research, and I guess that's why you're all members of the TAR network. Why is this important? It's important because we all want to bridge that valley of death. I would say it's also important for charities to defeat some disintermediation you might see. And what I mean by that is charity funds an academic lab for 10 years, puts 10 million in, a load of fundamental research is done, which is fantastic. And then the university uses a source of government money to fund the last 500K, during which period it files a loads of patents. And then it says, well, the charity, that funding, those patents weren't created using charity money, so you're not due anything. Now that is standard university behaviour. The way to defeat that is for the charity to provide translational funding. And it's a natural progression. If the academics already been taking the charity research money, they will probably push to take the translational funding because it's easy for them. So there is a good reason to provide translational funding as follow-on funding. And then investing in ventures, which is a slightly different form of translational activity, actually investing in startups emerging from these universities. And then we can also bring access to patients, which is clearly key. Next slide. I won't talk a lot about this. This is just saying that charities are currently only 3% of the venture capital going into university startups. But that number, you probably can't really see that graph on the left, but that number is going up and up and up. So I think charities are going to become more important for universities as venture funders in the future. Next slide. But universities are wary of taking charitable money. We must all acknowledge this. If they take money from industry, they have to give away the IP, but they get 130% of the full economic cost back. Typically, it's a rough number. If government funds it, okay, they only get 80% of the FEC, and then they get some top up from the charitable support fund. But the government also doesn't take any revenue share. So that's still attractive money, even if it doesn't quite cover the costs. When it comes to charity money, it's the least attractive of all for universities because it doesn't fund the full economic costs and it asks for a revenue share on intellectual property. So universities don't really want to take the charity money It's just there's not enough money in the system, and academics don't care where it comes from. So will that change? I don't know. If we see a new, more tech-savvy generation of academics coming through, there is a danger that they don't find the charity money attractive either, because they think it may personally, materially affect their economics. So it's just something to watch out for in the future. Next slide. Thanks. Why it's important for charities to connect with Tech Transfer Office, because I don't think we as charities do this very well. It's to track the impact. You can't, we fund the research and then we drop the ball on liaising with the Tech Transfer Office, who is the organization within the university likely to know what impact is arising from it. We sometimes rely on the academic to tell us, and they're not always great. They've got other priorities of telling us about it. So we need to find out what is happening with the research we're funding so that we can show our donors the impact the research is actually happening. And that involves more interaction with the tech transfer offices. So next slide, please. So to try and address this, there's the AMRC IP Best Practice Manual, which my guess is many people don't even know it exists, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of work that went into it. But this is designed to try and help charities interact with tech transfer offices, because sometimes the first interaction will be the tech transfer office looks at the grant terms and conditions. It finds a patent. It wants to commercialize it. It looks at the grant terms and conditions and sees that the charity has a consent right that says, the charity must consent to the commercialization. So then it bangs out a note to the charity, and the charity, unless it's very used to this, runs around saying, we don't know how to deal with this. And starts engaging lawyers or starts asking its trustees, and then that takes forever, which frustrates the university because they're trying to do a deal and they need a quick response, and there shouldn't be an issue with this. And so that consent right issue can often send people into a bit of a tiz. Secondly, the other area is reporting. So that's where I think on the consent right is where sometimes charities behave badly, not through malice, just by not knowing what to do. And then the other area where bad behavior can be is in reporting, which is on the tech transfer office, in that they should be reporting annually, generally under grant terms and conditions, what's going on. And they're not very good at that. And charities need to get better at chasing them, saying what's going on, give me an update on this research grant. Have any patents been filed? What's happening with it? So I think there are areas for both sides to improve. In the AMRC IP best guidance, it calls out what is good behavior and what is not. It's not, for example, it's not for charities to use that consent right to start telling the transfer office that you shouldn't be getting a 5% royalty, you should be getting a 6% royalty. That is inappropriate behavior from the charity. That's not what the consent right is for. The consent right is to ensure that the tech transfer office is doing something that helps that product get to patients as a market as quickly as possible. And also just to double check they're not doing anything that would damage the charity's reputation. So for example, for us, they're not doing a deal with a tobacco company. That's what the consent right's for. It's not to start interfering in the commercial terms or to slow the deal down. Equally, we need to chase universities on the reporting rights. So yeah, have a look at them, and they are very useful. They include also a phone a friend type thing where you can, if you're not clear on what to do, you can actually phone up a practitioner who will act as a neutral arbiter and help you deal with the tech transfer office if you're trying to negotiate an issue. Next slide, please. So I'm just coming towards the end now. So a couple of lessons we've learned along this sort of journey, but we are still learning. It's a constant learning journey. So next slide, please. What have we learned? We have learned, be really clear why you're doing this. I constantly have to remind our trustees and our management that this is not a business unit trying to generate profit for the charity. Charity shops on a high street sell second-hand goods, right? That is not core purpose. CRUK does not exist to sell second-hand goods. So therefore, it's a trading unit, and therefore it should be judged solely on whether or not it's generating a profit or not. That is very different to us. We are commercializing the IP that comes out of our research. That is entirely in line with our core purpose as filed at Companies House. And therefore, our job is not to generate money. It's just happily we do, but that's not why we exist. Secondly, be very clear where you're playing. So are you providing translational funding as well as research funding? Are you looking to control the IP? Are you looking to take a revenue share? If so, is that a reasonable share? Are you subcontracting this activity to someone else, like LifeArc or someone to support you doing it? Although I think they're stopping doing that now. And are you investing? Are you actually, you're not providing translational funding, you actually want to invest in startups. All of those things are fine and perfectly acceptable activities. You just need to be clear what space you're playing in. The point raised earlier, donors are not the same. Talk about that in a sec. And then a little goes a long way. So, I'm very lucky. I work for an organization that spent over 20 years building this, but we started small and it's taken us, a couple of decades to build it up to what it is now. But I think everyone can start small and you just micro investing, making small investments. You may not get a lot of money back from making a micro investment, but it allows you to much more easily track that company's development going forward because you're a shareholder, and then to use that as an impact case study with your donors. And that's where the real value lies. Next slide, please. And so to finish, this is one example of that donor story that we found is that we started out creating a seed fund. We said we put 15 million into it over 5 years. And we set ourselves a target of raising philanthropy against that, not knowing if we could achieve that. And that is where we really uncovered this whole new group of donors. And they're generally, when you look at their profile, they're ex-city types or bankers or venture capitalists um, but they care very much about the cause, but they want to see their money used in a different way, and they want to give their advice onto how to translate ideas. They want to help some of these companies and so on. And so that's really opened up a whole new cadre of donors for us. And we've now successfully got our 50th donor into our Cancer Impact Club and raised the 15 million. So we're very sort of pleased by that. Next slide. And then I'm not going to go through these. So these are the issues that came out of your recent sort of get together with the TAR network. But I think the important thing here is just that sort of thing on the right, which is saying, I think the more we team up, which is what the TAR network is doing, and the more we come up with common approaches, the better the experience it will be for everyone and for the university tech transfer offices. And there's also strength in numbers. If all the charities say the same things, it's harder for the tech transfer offices to argue against it. So I think that's it. I think next slide. I think that's the final one. Yeah, so this was just a sum up. So I won't go through this now. I'll pause at this point and I'll stop at this point, and then we can open it up to Q&A.